This is We Bleed Orange and Black, the podcast for Halloween and horror lovers. Join us as we interview creators, discuss our favorite horrors, and share original horror stories. My name's Jeff.
And I'm Ryan.
And this week, we're talking to author Patrick Barb. We are here with Patrick Barb. Patrick Barb is an author of weird, dark, and horrifying tales, currently living and trying not to freeze to death in St. Paul, Minnesota. He's the author of the dark urban fantasy novella Gargantuana's Ghost from Gray Matter Press, the talking animal / cosmic horror novella The Nut House, serialized in Cosmic Horror Monthly, and the forthcoming dark fiction collection Pre-Approved for Haunting from Keylight Books and Turner Publishing, coming in October 2023. Good afternoon, Patrick. So I've read a bunch of your stuff. It's sort of coming at me from all angles. It's kind of like when you are exposed to the supernatural. It like opens your third eye and then you're seeing it everywhere. So I read Patrick's novel Gargantuana, and then I read his novel Turn, and then like all my podcasts and like subscriptions just became attuned to Patrick's work, and it was coming at me through The Arcanist. And
ooh, the algorithm is working in your favor, Patrick.
Yeah, exactly.
It really is. It's I've really the bribes have paid off, getting the work out there, so I'm happy to hear it.
When I read stuff like your book, Helicopter Parenting in the Age of Drone Warfare, I feel like you are grappling with all these fears and pains of parenthood. I was wondering, what were some of your inspirations for exploring these very, very modern but very dark aspects of parenting?
I think a lot of it came from two sides of things. Being a parent myself, being a father of two boys, 7 and 4, and seeing the world as a parent and trying to be present in their lives. And you always kind of have this sense of, am I doing too much? Am I doing too little? And now with the introduction of screens and technology, things like that, there are these ways that we can, these new distractions that we have that can even distract you from the role of a parent in a lot of ways. And so, looking at that and then wanting to expand it in a science fiction horror direction. I mean, that is basically, that's what science fiction is taking this problem you have today and imagining it as the problem of tomorrow, essentially.
Attention! This is your official spoiler alert for helicopter parenting in the time of drone warfare. To avoid spoilers, please skip forward for 90 seconds.
But I was reading stories about like mass shooters and these parents of these kids who do these like sort of very heinous things, almost definitely inexcusable things. And then you sort of hear from the parents or the neighbors, and it's this whole, he was really quiet, he was nice, and you have to dig beneath the surface to get at what the relationship actually was. And that fascinated me in this sort of morbid kind of way of wanting to kind of get in that mind of the parent who has a child who is potentially capable of causing great damage or causing great harm, and to see where that relationship may have shifted or what may have been missing, and then applying the sort of sci-fi horror lens to it as well.
That strikes me as particularly fearless as a writer and as a parent, to explore the idea of raising a school shooter. It seems like that must have been very unpleasant to dwell on when you were writing the story, or just letting your mind kind of wander down those dark pathways. And it's interesting, I always feel like no sci-fi is relevant if it doesn't include drones. I really do feel like drones are going to be ubiquitous as time goes on. And in your story, overly concerned parents have drones following their kids everywhere. And, there's privacy protections in place, but, everyone's kind of working around them. And it's interesting that you look at the angle of surveillance both ways. What's a healthy amount of supervision, and then what is the effect of sort of living in sort of a de facto personalized police state where your parents can watch you all the time. And in this instance, it slowly becomes revealed that this kid has serious issues. There's something going on, and the father kind of watches from the outside of his broken family, what's going on, and maybe what he contributed to by being an absentee father. Do you think that in this scenario that the supervision is what caused the child to get twisted and lash out? Do you think it was the absenteeism?
I look at it as a combination of all those elements as being what has twisted this relationship. It is the surveillance state aspect of it and that personalized aspect of it, but it's also the passivity that is engendered by this constant surveillance. There's a sense from our main character, who's the father in this story, that because he has drones following his son, there is even contact lenses that are put on the eye permanently that record everything the child sees. He has this belief that I'm covered. I don't need to be as involved because I can see everything. And what is revealed as the story goes on and these layers are peeled back is that he doesn't actually see what's actually happening. There's this manipulation of media. And that was another thing that I wanted to explore, keeping it at this personal level. The idea of things that can be manipulated, like media that can be manipulated. In this case, it's just what he's seeing from his kid and surrounding his kid. But you see where he basically had this illusion that's shattered, essentially. And as he's letting go of everything that is personal to him, his marriage, his child, and focusing on work and the screens that are in front of him every day, he's not really seeing the whole picture, pardon the pun there. So that's kind of where it is, that mix of things that I was really going for.
Next, I want to hop over to a short story that you wrote that appeared recently in The Arcanist, which was called Haunting Lessons. Haunting Lessons is also about parental love and loss and grief. And to me, it felt like kind of a sort of a companion piece to helicopter parenting. What was your goal with that story?
That story originally started as a piece I was working on for a class I was taking. I had this idea of a father who has a son who is dying and is trying to teach his son how to be a ghost because he wants him to come back and haunt him after he has passed on. Again, this is written while I'm a parent. My kids are both healthy and fine and great, but you always, as a parent, you think about these things. And I think that parents that say they don't think about these things are lying to make themselves sleep better at night. And so I came from that premise of like, what would this be like? And as a story, I wanted to leave this layer of ambiguity. Whereas I think something like helicopter parenting in the age of drone warfare, being in this sci-fi horror space, has some very concrete elements to the speculative fiction aspect of it. There's these drones, there are these contact lenses, there's these things that are establishing this world in the future. Whereas with Haunting Lessons, it being a short story, being a piece of flash fiction, there's room there to let the reader fill in some blanks, to let them say, okay, this is actually a possibility. This child could potentially become a ghost. Or you can read it and say, this is not something that can happen. This is a world where it's like our world, and sometimes bad things happen to innocent children and these families that can be damaged by these occurrences. And sometimes people, in trying to cope with these situations, may make the wrong decisions, and these may impact their relationships with those who are left behind. And I think that's also something that carries through in both pieces as well, is not only just the parent and child relationship, but also how the parent is acting in that relationship and what happens afterward, and what they're left with as a result.
It seemed to me in Haunting Lessons that the sort of preemptive grief and the attachment, for lack of a better word, of the father with their sickly child created a distance, because he was so focused on later that he totally missed the present, that he was guaranteed to have a present experience with the child, and he was wrapped up in his anxiety of the future, or he was trying to avoid the grief and loss later by sort of ruining the present to try to scrounge out some kind of meager echo of his child in the future. And that really resonated for me with the helicopter parenting story, because he was so invested in protecting his child that he sort of put him under a magnifying glass and sort of wrecked his relationship in the present when he was supposed to be sort of guiding his child. So definitely some deep-seated fears of the father sort of plugged directly into the fiction. But I heard you talking earlier about how these courses led you to think outside the box and explore abstract or bizarro concepts, which leads me perfectly to Gargantuana's Ghost. Why don't you give us a capsule version, because I think it'll get away from me if I try to sum it up neatly.
Sure thing. I will. I've had a little bit of practice, so hopefully this comes across as clear as I can make it. Gargantuana's Ghost is a New York City set, dark urban fantasy, paranormal kaiju tale. Essentially, a young man in his 20s named Antoine, who is sort of obsessed with the history of New York and all of its little secrets. He learns about this giant ape, similar to like a King Kong type creature, who was brought to New York in this version of New York in the 1930s, fell off the train tracks in Brooklyn, and is now said to haunt the subway. And he connects with this ghost of the giant ape, who is able to sort of manipulate her form to be on top of the train and also inside the train. And he realizes that the ghost of this ape is longing for the little girl who was the daughter of the explorer who brought Gargantuana to New York in the first place. And they had this special bond. And he finds out that she still lives in Brooklyn. She's now an old woman named Letty. And he makes Antoine is trying to bring them together. So he's reached out to Letty and trying to get her to leave her nursing home where she's living to be reunited with this friend who is a ghost of a giant ape. And essentially, this story takes place on this one night where he's traveling. Antoine is traveling from Manhattan to Brooklyn on the F train, and these three are brought together. Things occur along this journey, and it's really this story of these three very different beings coming together and connecting.
In the book, you compare a King Kong style event to 9/11, which was really fascinating because in the world of your story, most people don't remember when Gargantuana came to New York, and you would think this was like an earth-shattering discovery that would change the course of history. And I remember 9/11, and I thought it was going to define American history forever, or at least the rest of my lifetime. And very quickly after, despite the catchphrase, never forget, people born around the time of 9/11, it's kind of like a footnote to them, like Pearl Harbor. And I thought that was plausible. Would you say that, was memory important, or was it sort of about the ties that bound these characters together?
Again, it's column A and column B. History and the memory of the past was a big factor, like a big motif that I wanted to include and explore. And each of my 3 viewpoint characters, so you get chapters that are from Antoine's perspective, you get chapters that are from Letty, the 90-year-old woman who first met Gargantuana when she was living, and you also get some chapters from Gargantuana's perspective, which is a more of an animalistic, she's a giant ape, so you're not going to get too much depth, but you do get a little bit of it, or I try to instill some of that in what's happening. Each of the 2 human characters, though, are dealing with memories of a father who is imperfect. This time I'm taking the father and son or father and child relationship and doing it from the child's perspective. So a little bit of variety, mixing it up a little bit for folks. But also not just these paternal relationships, but also, as you said, the relationship with the city. I lived in New York for 7 years, and it always felt like a place where things are happening. You feel like you are, in a way, it's very true. You feel like you're at the center of the universe in a certain respect. At the same time, you feel like if I step off this carousel, nobody's going to miss me. The horses are going to keep going around and around. The Calliope music's going to keep playing. And that is another thing that I wanted to explore, is this relationship with New York as this focal point for the characters, as a focal point for history, and showing how things that can seem like a big deal to the individual can fade from the memory of society or from a city. And sometimes there's traces that you can find, like ghosts, let's say, that are left behind. But if it's not talked about, if you leave things on a long enough timeline, they're going to be smaller in their impact and in who they are affecting. And that's sort of where this Gargantuana incident comes into play, is that it's far enough along that really everything's changed. New York has moved on. The trains are put back together. The buildings are rebuilt. That's what they do. It's a positive, to be sure. But the memories of those affected, or those who have researched these things, they don't go away. And so that's where that comes from in the book.
How did you extrapolate stream of time, fading public consciousness into giant ape? Or was it like, I want to do a giant ape story, and then you figured out all that other stuff?
Yeah, I mean, come on. You got to do a giant ape story, right? I love King Kong, Mighty Joe Young, Godzilla, all those sort of giant monsters and kaiju and things like that. I am a huge fan. I always liked King Kong a little more because there always felt like there was that human connection that the character has in all the incarnations, all the movies, and all of the my kids are watching the cartoons these days, but there's always that human element to the giant ape character, because it feels like, oh, he or she kind of is almost like us, but giant and furry. And so then I was like, okay, well, how can I get this giant ape on a train? And that was the next step. And then I was like, okay, it'll be, it's dead, so it's a ghost. And so size is all, relative. We can fit inside or outside of the train. And I just like this. And then once you start thinking about that, very practical concerns, right? Like, how do I get this ape on a train? Then it essentially becomes, okay, well, then what is the story? If it is a ghost of a giant ape, what's the story there? And I built things from there. So a little peek behind the creative curtain.
Well, that's actually encouraging for even for someone like myself who has been writing for many years, where it's like, to hear you talk, it's very intellectual and very almost intimidating how thought out all these themes and everything are. But to hear it framed as like, well, I had this cool idea and I kind of, spun it out from there.
It's organic and it comes from a place of fun.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I look at every premise that I come up with is based on like a cool idea. Like I like to think of things that I would like to read. Obviously, that's step number one. But then also things that are kind of twists on common characters or common elements in horror or other genres in like the spec fic arena. And then a lot of times the themes and motifs will emerge from there. It's not like they're coming spontaneously. I think these are themes that as authors, we kind of find are themes that we are wrestling with, that we are exploring. And you can see in my work, I think, a lot of these ideas repeated. But then it's like finding the like cool concept and idea, and then saying, okay, how does this relate to those themes? And then they kind of come organically from there.
I couldn't have asked for a better segue to talk about your new book, Turn. Would you give us a little summary or a logline for Turn?
Sure. Turn, published last month from Alien Buddha Press, is a vampire pro wrestling novella set in the world of indie deathmatch hardcore wrestling. A jobber who's a wrestler who is basically their job is to lose, discovers that the champion of this company he's working for, who's playing a vampire in the ring, is actually a real life vampire and is using the bloody hardcore matches to hide his feelings. And it's a story about this wrestler who is trying to find his own place in the wrestling business and sees the power that this vampire wrestler has, both as the champion and as a undead bloodsucker. And he decides that he wants to have both of those things.
Sprinkled throughout are all these Dracula references from the novel Bram Stoker's Dracula, and there's your Renfield, stand-in. There's your Dracula stand-in, and then some of the other characters are references to the supporting cast of Dracula, and Renfield is always going to be an underdog in a Dracula story, and we know usually how Renfield's story ends. But Turn appropriately takes a turn on what we think we know about a typical Dracula story. What inspired you to sort of use Dracula's sort of framework as a launching point? I mean, I guess it would have been too predictable if it had just followed the arc of Dracula. But why did it... I don't want to give anything away, so spoiler alert, but, it ends in a very different place from where you might think a Dracula story might go.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it sprang from... I got this the Blu-ray set of all the Universal horror monster movies not too long ago, and I've been going through them, and I watched Dracula, and I hadn't watched the Bela Lugosi Dracula in a long time, probably since I was a kid and had gotten like VHS copies or something like that and watched them. And I always feel like the the Renfield in those movies is such a fantastic performance. It's a little very unhinged. He's eating the bugs. He's got the maniacal laughter down, and it's a character who I always felt like had this sort of menace beneath the surface. Like he sometimes is trying to help, but he's always looking out for himself at the end of the day, even though he serves Dracula. And so I thought of these wrestlers who are basically like cannon fodder, let's say, for like the jobber in wrestler is the person who they're doing the job of laying down, getting the 1, 2, 3 for the champ to make these wrestlers who are supposed to be the stars look good. And that's essentially what Renfield is doing in movie incarnations in the books. He's meant to make whether it's like Jonathan Harker or Dracula himself look more powerful. And I like this idea of these power dynamics shifting. Like, how can you take someone who is not expected to be hero, villain, or anti-hero? They're sort of serving this subservient role, and twisting that, making them, both building them up as a character that you can view as a protagonist, meaning they're the person who we're focusing on, and then take it even further to sort of make them a villain in a way, or or anti-hero, whatever you want to call it, that we are actively, that the readers are actively either rooting for or rooting against, depending on what point of the story we might be in. And so, yeah, that's where it started from, was just taking that character in that relationship and saying, what if it went in a different way? And what if we put the spotlight on this character that normally doesn't have the spotlight?
So, spoilers for the end of the story. The jobber does get the power that he wants, and this power corrupts very quickly, very completely, and very horrifically. And I was wondering if there was a theme to be teased out there. Was it about fame or celebrity? What was it that your Renfield character was seeking that just totally destroyed them?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a little bit of fame and just power in general. I think we have these characters that are desirous of power. They want to have what our Dracula stand-in this case has, and they believe they are ready to have that same power. And with the character of Bug, who is the protagonist here, he believes that he is on the same level as Draxel, who is the champion and the Dracula stand-in in this case. And what I wanted to show is that, yes, he is capable of winning, getting the belt, getting the power, but how will that change him? And is he ready? Has he been groomed in the way that, look at a character like of Dracula. Dracula is a count. He has been raised in this world. In this case, the Dracula stand-in, or Draxel, is someone who has been groomed to be a champion. He's gotten that path that popular wrestlers like The Rock or John Cena or whoever you're talking about are guided down to be the number one guy in a company. And they're prepared for that moment when they win the title. With the character of Bug, I'm trying to have a character who is in a world that is scripted to a degree. Outcomes are sort of predicted. You have him trying to forge his own path, trying to write his own story. And what happens at the end is basically he gets what he asked for, he gets what he hoped for, but at a great cost, essentially.
Mm. I can tell that there was a tremendous amount of love and immersion in the sort of jobber lifestyle I liked seeing how Bug lived, how he lived from match to match, and sort of all the aches and pains and all the squalor that came with it. It really gave those Renfield vibes. It was totally believable that you would have a Renfield character as a sort of cannon fodder in an extreme wrestling league. So that was very inspired, and I hate to be that guy, but I could imagine a sort of Universal Monsters pantheon of other wrestling stories, that take on Mummy or Creature from the Black Lagoon. Invisible Man, not so much. I don't think that would make for a very good wrestling.
And entertaining, though, I think. If
Yes.
a skilled enough opponent who could really sell, I think the Invisible Man match would be, one to watch out for.
Yeah, I think as a tag team partner, I think Invisible Man would be great. You just see the chair floating up in the air.
Just ties the laces together of the boots. They just trip. Yeah, absolutely. It's great. I love those. I grew up, watching those Universal monster movies. I had an art teacher in elementary school who introduced me to comic books and those old monster movies, and even showed them in class once. We watched the Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman across like 2 art classes, which I don't really know what it has to do with art, but black and white, they're really pretty to look at, I guess. And so I watched all those movies, and the characters are so fascinating. There's a horror element, to be sure, of those monsters, but they're also their own kind of category of film in a lot of ways. And I like playing with those character types, like the Dracula or your Frankenstein's monster or Wolfman, Mummy, etc. And so this gave me a chance to basically take 2 of the things that I love, which are pro wrestling and the sort of Dracula monster character, and smash them together and see what comes out of it. That's a lot of my creative process. Sometimes it's just taking these 2 things that I like and just smashing them together. It's the way I played with like action figures when I was a kid. I just keep doing it today, but without the physical objects necessarily.
So if I could shift lanes here for just a little bit, you have a story in the forthcoming anthology, That's What I Call Horror, an anthology of 90s horror. And we cover a lot of 90s horror on our podcast here when we review episodes of Are You Afraid of the Dark and Goosebumps and things like that. What was your story about, and how do you define 90s horror?
Great question. So That's What I Call Horror is an anthology that myself and some other horror writer friends have got together, and we wanted to do something that was in that era of 90s horror. I think you're seeing more and more of nostalgia, I think, for the 90s era of horror, whether it is the Goosebumps, Are You Afraid of the Dark? And for a long time, it was all 80s. We were getting all these remakes of the 80s slashers and things like that. And 90s horror, in the case of this book, it's both a combination of what was being seen in the horror genre at the time, and also taking trends from the 90s and exploring them through a horror lens. So in the case of this anthology, it's a little bit of both, a little bit from both sides of what 90s horror is. I really came to horror in the sort of mid to late 90s, in looking at things like Scream and that sort of the run of these sort of like 90s slashers, which tended to be a little bit more shinier in a way, and also maybe moving away from some of the more subversive elements you may have seen in like the 70s and 80s. And my story is called The End of the Horror Story. It's a story about the sort of last vestiges of a slasher franchise that started in the 80s, and they're sort of squeezing the last bit of money out of it by making a sequel, and they're filming it in Siberia after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So it's combining this sort of like the tail end of what a lot of people viewed as like quote unquote good horror and good horror movies. Everyone was always, I feel like in the 90s there was a lot of like complaints about, oh, it's not the same as it was. It's not the same as it was in the 80s and the 70s, and there are no tits and blood and gore and it's all these things. And it's like there's still plenty of things to be afraid of out there in the world. Yeah. And I mean, there's also this, one of the things in my story is that it is a found footage story in certain parts. Sort of that sort of move, I think, at the end of the 90s into like Blair Witch and things like that. I think that was a really pivotal moment for horror. I mean, at least for me as a fan. I can remember going to the theater with my dad and having him tell me that he never wanted me to bring him to another movie again because he got motion sick at the movie. But I think that I wanted to sort of play from like a meta narrative level with this idea of how the horror genre evolved in the 90s and where it ended up and where we moved to in the 2000s and beyond. At the same time, hopefully, it's also a story that is creepy and scary. It's about sort of this making of this movie and things go wrong, which is always my favorite way to write horror stories. Is something is supposed to happen, but things go wrong, and so it's definitely squarely in that arena.
In the 90s, it could be said that it was the end of horror as we knew it, because we were entering that phase of the genre where we get into deconstruction and meta-narrative, which may sound very high-minded, but basically I'm talking about the Scream franchise. Scream was meta-commentary. It was a horror movie about horror movies, and it was a lot slicker than your average Friday the 13th movie, but still a very classic film in its own right. That's given me a lot to think about in terms of 90s horror, and even with the found footage stuff, that is a sort of meta narrative of its own, because you're watching a reconstruction of events. You've got that distance from it. And technologically, you could have had people with the 80s running around with camcorders, but, little tiny battery packs and giant chunky tapes, much more believable in the 90s when everyone had these handheld video cameras. So I would like to jump into some classic Halloween questions. Okay. Best and worst costume. What's the best costume you've ever had and the worst costume?
Best costume, I probably when my oldest son was born, and we went as Bob Belcher and Linda Belcher from Bob's Burgers, and my son was about barely 2 months old at the time, and he was a burger. And I had grown out a beard for just like having a kid and just sort of not having to go to work. And then I shaved it down to a mustache. I had the sort of like apron and the white t-shirt look, and my wife had the red glasses and her hair done up like the character from Bob's Burgers. And it was great. And not only was it great, we went to 2 Halloween parties with our little burger baby, and he slept through all of it. And it was the last time. It was the very last time we have ever been out past 9 o'clock on a Halloween night. Since then, it's all been going trick-or-treating and going to bed as quickly as possible. Worst costume, I think I love all my costumes. just because it's like, I put the work in, and you want to like, it's all about how you enjoy it. So I think for me, worst costume is more like worst response I've gotten from a costume. In some of my adult years, we'll say, I dressed up as my wife and I dressed up as Walter White and Jesse from Breaking Bad, and we had rock candy.
Who was Walter White and who was Jesse?
I was Walter, and my wife was Jesse. She had the beanie on and everything, and we had these bags of blue rock candy, and we were at a party. This was in New York, and we said, "Hey, this is crystal meth." And we were joking, obviously, and somebody said, "Oh, really?" And so I was like, "That's just, come on, man. Like, that's too much."
Nobody crushed up the rock candy and snorted it, leading to a catastrophe.
No, and nobody wanted to. They moved very far away from us and thought we were actually bringing drugs to their Halloween party. Like,
this rock candy is tight.
But no, they did not. They just did not understand. And then I went as Macho Man to get my wrestling credentials out there. And my friends,
with Slim Jim or without?
I had the Slim Jims, and I had like the cowboy hat and like the fringe and everything. Yeah, and I'm not necessarily a very muscular guy. I still am not. And we were walking by, my friends and I. My friend is one is dressed up as Roddy Piper, has the kilt and the whole like hot rod shirt on. The other friend is dressed up as the Iron Sheik. He's got the turban. He's got like a fake muscles on and everything. And passerby says to me, "Who are you supposed to be?" And I say, "I'm the macho man. And this gentleman says, "You must be Macho Man if he was on crack." And so that was just a real kind of like, oh, okay, yeah, that's it. That is exactly what I was going for. So it's always about like how people respond to these costumes, that I'm always like, they're even if it's like the worst response possible, I won't forget it anytime soon.
You're always guaranteed some baffling responses from people, especially when you're doing your best to present something that is so thoroughly mainstream pop culture. Ryan, do you want to tell them about your Jack the Ripper?
Had him a big top hat, white gloves, black frock coat, a knife, a big giant butcher's knife, completely splattered with blood, dipped my white gloves in blood, dark circles around the eyes, sunken cheeks, and everyone was like, "Dead Abraham Lincoln." Awesome.
Too soon.
I guess it was because it was basically the top hat and the beard. I'd cut like a Van Dyke, and that's all it takes to be Abraham Lincoln.
That's really the slasher that I want to see. Is just he's back from the theater and looking for revenge.
Right. Lincoln. The bullet didn't kill him, but it altered his personality, Phineas Gage style.
The notices are in.
Yeah.
That's great.
Impossible costume. What is a costume you've always wanted to try but could never achieve?
I'm a big comic book fan. Like, obviously now everyone is. It seems like, but I was like, grew up reading comic books, Spider-Man, X-Men, Superman, all the sort of the usual things like that. And I've just never done the superhero costume, though. Even as a kid, I never dressed up as a superhero. I never wanted to wear the kind of padded muscles of like the kids' costumes. And so really like some sort of like superhero, like Spider-Man or something, has always been one that I could probably do. I could probably put on a costume. The closest I came to that was I did the sort of Peter Parker from Into the Spider-Verse with the just sort of Spider-Man t-shirt and the jacket.
What a gift to regular Joes everywhere who don't want to shave.
Like, yes.
Yeah.
Thank you so much to the makers of that film.
Right.
Yeah, but that's really kind of where. So it's not impossible, I would say, but just something that I have not myself felt inclined to do.
Yeah, for me, it's Ghost Rider. I want to just have a full-on bitchin' flaming skull with the best looking. Yeah, well, who knows? Maybe I'll have to wait until we all have AR contact lenses.
We could like stuntman you. We'll just light your head on fire and extinguish it throughout.
Yeah,
the night.
I'll be Ghost Rider for a tenth of a second at a time. Yeah, there were some early costumes where I was so covered in spirit gum and latex and like flannable like padding and baffling that I was like, if someone flicks a cigarette, I will literally turn into at least Dormammu in this costume.
Excellent.
Best and worst candy.
Best and worst candy. This is going to be the most controversial part of the podcast.
Gonna drop some bombs.
Yeah, this is the hot take part of the podcast. So,
better not be black licorice. That's all I'm saying.
Oh, that is maybe the worst, but not for me. My wife is certainly opposed to the black licorice. For me, the worst candy that I can get in my bag is Three Musketeers. I think that it is just a sort of dull candy. It's the chocolate, it's the nougat, and that's it. It's like they stopped before they added the good stuff. And for me, my favorite candy, and one that I always see people trashing online, and I don't understand it because Tootsie Rolls exist, so they don't like. If you want to like attack a candy, I love Milky Way. I love caramel and nougat and the chocolate of the Milky Way.
Isn't a Milky Way essentially a Three Musketeers with caramel in it?
It is, and that is the difference. It's caramel is the difference.
Just that little thing.
For me, it's that little thing. It's like, okay, you tried a little bit harder than Mr. Three Musketeers did. And then Snickers are great. I just don't always like peanuts, so that kind of excludes that one.
So you really dialed in. Somewhere between Three Musketeers and Snickers is your sweet spot.
I tuned it perfectly. Just that's where they can stop right there. I love a lot of Halloween candy. My kids have a bunch of it right now, and it's their buckets might be getting lower day by day.
That's what we call the angel share. It just evaporates into the air. We don't know why, where.
It's hard to say, really. But like, I love all, with the exception of those things like black licorice. I'll even eat a Three Musketeers. I hate it, but I'll eat it. I love candy corn. I love Tootsie Rolls. Give me all those things. As a parent, I've come to not like ring pops as much. I never was really I'm never really a big fan of them, but they make a huge mess.
Those all day suckers, yeah.
It's just they're sticky and they're gross, and you're just left with. They never finish them. So it's always just like stuck to the carpet or stuck to the dog or something.
And you have to finish it. You're like, ugh, I can't let this ring pop go.
If I have to, yeah, exactly. Like I'll do it if I have to. Like just twist my arm. But yeah, you're hard pressed to find something where I'm totally against it though.
One last lightning round question: best Halloween, East Coast, West Coast, or Middle Coast?
I grew up in Southeast Virginia, so I consider that sort of more, it's a little bit of South and a little bit of the East Coast there. And we always had these sort of like perfect neighborhood Halloweens with every house, with the exception of maybe one or two in the neighborhood, done up with the pumpkins and the porch lights. And we'd go around. There was always that one house at the end of the block that had the parent who would dress up as like a scarecrow or a zombie, and you think it's just a scarecrow sitting there, but go get the candy and they're going to leap up and grab you and you're going to run. And we had cornfields nearby the neighborhood that I would go to, so it always had this very fall creepy vibe for me. So I think I'm biased because that is where I grew up and what I remember from trick-or-treating. Since having lived on the West Coast and now being kind of in the middle, probably rank the West Coast the lowest, just because it's hard to tell that it's fall. Like with Halloween, I need those leaves to change color. I need it to be that sort of wind that's at the back of your neck. And you definitely get that here in the Midwest as well. So if I was ranking them, East Coast, Midwest, and then the West Coast is, in my case, sadly, finishing last.
So you move from east to west in your rankings.
Yes.
That's fair. I think a lot of people would agree with you. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're working on next, and finally, where our listeners can find more of your work?
Coming out at the end of November, I have Helicopter Parenting in the Age of Drone Warfare from Spooky House Press. That is my sci-fi horror novelette. We talked about a little bit here. And then I am currently wrapping up the serialization of my talking animal crime cosmic horror novella, The Nut House, which involves squirrels who are trying to steal a cache of acorns inside this house in the suburbs that run into some weird and frightening things. That's out through Cosmic Horror Monthly, and the final chapter of that is out in December, their December issue. And then next Halloween, so people want to mark their calendars for a year from now, on Halloween, my short fiction collection, Pre-Approved for Haunting, is coming out from Keylight Books and Turner Publishing. It is a 18-story collection featuring 15 reprint stories. You get all my stories from various magazines and anthologies all in one place, and 3 original tales as well. And that's out again in about a year. And then otherwise, I have a few short stories here and there coming out in anthologies, working on some other novella-length projects, and a possible novel here on the horizon as well. So trying to keep busy with all of that. If anyone else wants to check out my work, I have a website, Patrick Barb. That's Patrick, BARB.com. And that has links to all of my short stories, novellas, the novelettes as well, or if not where you can read or listen to them, then where you can buy them as well. And I am on Twitter while it lasts, for however long that may be, twitter.com/pbarb as well.
Patrick, thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This was a lot of fun. I really appreciate talking with you guys.
Follow us on Instagram and Twitter at webobpodcast. Contact us at webobpod@gmail.com, or subscribe on iTunes. You can find Ryan at 20th Century RG with the number 20 on YouTube, and you can find me at jeffccarter.com. And hit the link to pick up my collection, We Bleed Orange and Black, 31 fun-sized tales for Halloween. Until next time, stay spooktacular. I assure you, this is all blood.
Perfect.